Christopher Columbus is usually remembered as the man who discovered America. That phrasing is convenient, confident, and wrong in ways that mattered immediately and kept mattering for generations. Columbus did not believe he had found a new continent, and he never accepted that conclusion even as evidence accumulated against him. This was not a footnote error or a semantic dispute. It was the foundation of how he justified his authority, how he governed the territories he controlled, how wealth was extracted, and how Europe initially interpreted the lands it had entered. To understand why that denial persisted and why it produced such durable consequences, you have to begin before the voyage itself, with the mathematics and incentives that made Columbus an outlier rather than a visionary. Columbus's central argument was straightforward. Asia could be reached quickly by sailing west. This was not a radical claim in a world that already accepted a spherical Earth. What separated Columbus from the maritime establishments of his time was not courage or imagination, but arithmetic. Scholars in Iberia were working with circumference estimates drawn from classical authors and refined by Islamic astronomers. Those figures placed Asia far beyond the carrying capacity of 15th century ships. Columbus rejected them. He combined a smaller circumference with an inflated eastward extension of Asia, compressing the ocean by thousands of miles. On paper, the journey became survivable. In reality, it required multiple errors to align perfectly. This is why Portugal declined him. Portugal was not risk-averse by temperament. It was aggressively expansionist, but it was also methodical. By the late 1400s, Portuguese sailors were accumulating reliable data along the African coast, prevailing winds, currents, ports, and resupply intervals. Their route to Asia was slow but measurable, and it produced incremental returns. Columbus offered none of that. His proposal could not be tested in stages, and it allowed no margin for miscalculation. For a state managing limited capital and long planning horizons, the expected value was poor. Castile initially agreed. What changed was not the math, but the political context. Crown of Castile had just concluded the war against Granada. Ships were idle. Soldiers were unemployed. The Crown was eager to compete with Portuguese expansion without committing to decades of coastal exploration. Funding Columbus did not signal scientific confidence. It reflected a shift in downside risk. If he failed, the loss was bounded. If he succeeded, the payoff could be transformative. This was not visionary belief. It was a calculated gamble on an unlikely outcome. When Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492, the evidence in front of him contradicted his premise almost immediately. The coastlines did not resemble known Asian geography. The distances between islands were inconsistent with established travel accounts. The people, languages, crops, and animals bore no resemblance to descriptions of East or South Asia. Yet Columbus insisted these were peripheral islands near the Asian mainland. He called the inhabitants Indians, not symbolically but literally, because his contracts, titles, and share of profits depended on having reached Asia. This insistence was not confusion. It was strategy. Columbus's authority as governor and his promised revenues were legally tied to his claim. Admitting he had found something else would have weakened his position and invited renegotiation. When reports suggested that the lands were larger and richer than expected, he did not reconsider the premise. He expanded it. Asia, he argued, must be broader, more fragmented, or divinely distorted. The claim adapted because it had to. That false premise shaped how he governed. Operating under the assumption that he was on the outskirts of Asia, Columbus treated extraction as the primary objective. Gold was not just wealth, it was evidence. When significant deposits did not materialize quickly, coercion escalated. Tribute quotas were imposed. Forced labor expanded. Punitive violence increased. These actions were not the result of misunderstanding local societies. They were responses to institutional pressure, created by a claim that required constant validation. The Spanish crown eventually removed Columbus from authority, but not because he was wrong about geography. He was removed because his administration produced instability, legal complaints, and declining returns. Even then, the monarchy avoided directly contradicting his Asian claim for years. Official language shifted slowly. Practical governance shifted faster. Settlements moved inland. Trade patterns adapted. Cartography evolved. Columbus did not. Until his death, he argued that rivers, peninsulas, or divine design explained away every contradiction. This refusal mattered because it framed early European interpretation of the Americas. If these lands were Asia, then existing legal frameworks for conquest, conversion, and labor could be applied without modification. Indigenous societies were treated as peripheral populations rather than sovereign polities. There was no conceptual space for negotiated coexistence because the premise did not allow for it. A new continent would have required new categories. Asia did not. The economic outcomes were uneven. Spanish institutions adjusted once the scale of the lands became undeniable. Columbus did not. He lost legal battles over titles and revenue. His heir spent decades in court with mixed results. Meanwhile, the Spanish state benefited from silver flows, agricultural expansion, and territorial claims that far exceeded anything Columbus had envisioned. The system moved on because it could. The individual could not, because his identity and compensation were locked to a claim that reality had already invalidated. Portugal's earlier rejection appears less conservative in hindsight. Their route to Asia worked. It produced sustained trade, predictable returns, and institutional learning. Columbus's voyage succeeded only because it collided with an unknown landmass at exactly the point where his error became survivable. Had the Americas not existed, his crew would have died at sea. This is not conjecture. It is arithmetic. The popular narrative portrays Columbus as a man ahead of his time, opposed by scholars who thought the earth was flat. The historical record shows the opposite. He was rejected because experts had better data. He succeeded because they underestimated the probability of an uncharted continent intervening between Europe and Asia. Columbus did not prove them wrong. Geography did. By the early 16th century, others accepted what Columbus would not. Amerigo Vespucci and subsequent cartographers recognized that these lands were not Asia. The idea of a new world entered European thought. Administrative and legal frameworks adjusted accordingly. This was an institutional correction, not a personal one. Columbus's writings grew more defensive as evidence mounted, because admitting error would have meant admitting that his life's work rested on a mistake. The measurable outcome is straightforward. Columbus initiated sustained contact between Europe and the Americas, but his claims about what he found were wrong. His miscalculation did not advance knowledge. It delayed its acceptance. His refusal to revise his position influenced early colonial policy in ways that intensified extraction and violence without improving governance. States learned. Empires adapted. Columbus did not. This case illustrates a recurring pattern in history. Large outcomes are often produced not by individuals being right, but by institutions correcting individual errors after exploiting them. Columbus was persistent, not accurate. He was funded because his failure was affordable and his unlikely success was exploitable. When reality contradicted him, power structures adjusted around him rather than through him. The world changed not because he understood it, but because others eventually stopped believing him. That is a fascinating, data-driven perspective on Columbus that moves away from the visionary trope and focuses on the institutional and mathematical reality of his voyage.